Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I would like to welcome all of you. It is indeed a distinct honor today for the Arab Center and for me personally to host our dear friend, Phyllis Bennis, to discuss her new book that is placed at the front, at the head table here, Understanding Palestine and Israel, published this year by Olive Branch Press and available for sale for those of you who are interested in picking a copy up front. As all of you are aware, what we have here is an audience that's well-versed in Arab-Israeli matters, just judging from looking around the room. As all of you are aware, today marks day 678 in the Israeli genocidal war on Gaza. The past 22 months have been quite a bloody period in the modern history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, specifically the Israeli-Palestinian component of that conflict, where we have seen massive casualties, particularly since September 7, 2023, exceeding, as of July 30th, exceeding 62,000 Palestinians and 1,983 Israelis dead, and over 153 people injured or maimed, according to the United Nations records. Observers throughout the world, including here in the United States, have been watching in horror since the beginning of the war in October 7, again, as I said, and the subsequent Israeli war of vengeance that started 20 days later on the 27th of October as Israel invaded the Gaza Strip in revenge. The brutal nature of the war and its impact on the two main protagonists, as well as other stakeholders in the region and globally, have refocused public attention worldwide on the underlying conflict, if you will, that has afflicted the region for many decades, at least, depends when you want to start counting as the beginning of this conflict, but at least for some of us old-timers, 77, 78 years ago. Analysts and general observers are trying these days to decipher basic questions about this war. What is this conflict about? Who are the Palestinians? What do they want? What is Zionism? How does it relate to Judaism? What is Israel's relations with the Jewish diaspora? What are Israel's objectives in this war in Gaza? What is Hamas? What is the relationship between Hamas and the PLO and the PA? What is US policy on Gaza? And why is the United States siding with Israel in this conflict? Why is Israel so isolated internationally, particularly at the United Nations? How do Americans, Europeans, and Arabs in the region look at the conflict? Is there a feasible political solution to the Palestine issue? And finally, what does it take to pursue such a just and lasting peace in the Middle East? These and many, many other questions seem to be kind of the talk of the day in the aftermath of October 7, 2023. Fundamental questions that have prompted regional experts throughout the world to try to explain these basic issues as the conflict keeps popping its head intermittently, often disturbing regional and global stability in the process, which brings us to understanding Palestine and Israel. The Herculean effort by Phyllis Bennis, trying to attempt to basically answer these questions and shed some light on the controversy associated with some of these issues is basically the rationale behind this book, as Phyllis will explain to you in just a minute. As you all know, Phyllis is a renowned American writer, researcher, political activist, and media commentator, aside from being a good friend for many, many years. And she has commented on various issues about the Middle East and US policy or policies throughout the region. She has been a strong advocate of Palestinian rights and a vocal critic of Israeli and US policies on Palestine and regional politics in general. Phyllis has written and edited more than a dozen books, actually, on the region, including several primers, following the same kind of Q&A format as this book. Very useful, again, for those who want a real solid, serious, dependable introduction to the conflict. She has also contributed numerous articles to national and international magazines and journals on the region. Phyllis is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she directs the New Internationalism Project, and she serves as international advisors to Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been a very vocal group in this conflict. I should mention that for those who do not know, Phyllis was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. Phyllis will speak for about 12, 15 minutes to, again, discuss her personal experience in putting this book together. And there will be a Q&A session after that. So please use the Q&A cards that are in front of you on the table. Indicate, if you don't mind, your name, your affiliation, if you care to do so, and be brief in order for me to accommodate as many questions to Phyllis as possible. Phyllis, the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Khalil.
Thank you.
And thank you to the Arab Center. Thank you to all of you for showing up on this muggy summer day. It's August. Nobody's supposed to be in Washington. Right now, Washington is under occupation. We have to be very conscious of that. Not the same kind of occupation that our siblings across Gaza, the Middle East, and East Jerusalem are facing, but a kind of occupation nonetheless. You know, as I was preparing some notes and some ideas for what to talk about today, about the book, I was looking up, you know, one of the rules we have is you can't be loud and wrong. When you're speaking out, you have to be right about your numbers. But it turns out it's actually very difficult. Not because it's hard to find the information, but because it changes so fast. So I was looking up the total number of people who have been killed by the Israeli policy of imposing hunger on the people of Gaza. And it was a shocking number. It was 218. And a little while later, I realized I had forgotten to write it. I went back to check, and it was now 235. The numbers go up exponentially, too fast and too dramatically. In the 6 journalists that were killed the other day, 5 of them from Al Jazeera, 1 a freelancer, including Anas al-Sharif, who many of you may have seen in the last couple of years, one of the key commentators at Jazeera. He was only 28 years old, and he was one of the oldest of this team, right? The others were in their early 20s. They're young. People are dying way too young. And we now know that, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, for over a year now, Gaza has been the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist. There have been more journalists killed in Gaza in these less than 2 years than in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and Iraq combined. Because journalists are a protected class in international law. They are never to be targeted, right? Some get killed in crossfires, some are killed in other ways, but they are never to be targeted. In Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere, journalists are being targeted. As we know from the killing of Shireen in May of 2023, that this is not only in Gaza. We know that Gaza has become the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. The total number of people who have been killed in Gaza in this genocidal assault is somewhere over 62,000. That's a very low number because that's the number that the health authorities have names, identification numbers, and ages of each of those people. It does not include the thousands. The estimates are somewhere between 12 and 14,000 people who have been buried in the rubble under the buildings. No one knows how many. They are not accounted for. They're not included here. People who have died at home, and in many cases have been either left unburied or buried at home because it's too dangerous to leave home, which is a shredded tent, are also not included. So this is a very low number, but of that number, we know that almost half of them are children. And that's why UNICEF has said that it is the most dangerous place to be a child. Of the people who have died of hunger, the other weapon beyond the air strikes and the drone strikes and the tank fire, the weapon of hunger that Israel is using with such skill, almost half of them are children as well. And at the same time, the incredible irony of this is that in this country and in much of the rest of the world, the shift in the discourse is perhaps, Khalil and I were just talking about this, maybe the greatest we have ever seen, at least since 1967. I was saying maybe since 1988, when there was a shift, a major shift at the time of the first Intifada, the first uprising, when suddenly the image of Palestinians in the United States shifted from they are all terrorists to, well, at least some of them seem to be victims. Now that's a far cry from saying they are people with agency, with rights. It wasn't that yet, but it was a huge shift nonetheless in 1988. This, I think, is bigger than that one. I'm going to go with your numbers, Khalil, on this one, at least on this one. That since 1967, we have not seen this level of a shift in the discourse. The fact that 43% of voters across this country now say that Israel is committing genocide. That's extraordinary. We started back in, I guess it was around 2000, 2001, the debate began in a big way about whether or not we should be calling the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem apartheid. The debate was not over whether that's correct. That was very clear. Palestinians and South Africans had long known that. That was not a question. The question was a very tactical one. Was it a good idea to start using that language? Or would it inevitably force us into the debate about whether or not that's the right word, rather than what is Israel actually doing? And at the time, the majority of us that were engaged in those discussions ended up deciding it wasn't yet the right time, that we didn't want to get caught up in the debate over whether or not it was the right word. We wanted the focus to be on what Israel was doing and why it had to end. It took 20 years to normalize that language. That was the time by 2021 when Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and agencies within the United Nations and Israeli human rights groups, B'Tselem and Yesh Din and others, all began issuing major, complicated reports proving the international law definition applied. This was no longer a question. Members of Congress began to use that language. Faith leaders began to use that language. So that's done. That debate is over, that this is apartheid. But it took 20 years. It took less than 20 days since the beginning of the Israeli assault on Gaza following the attacks of October 7th for the language to shift to genocide. 1 week after the attacks began, 400 global experts, academics, and researchers on the Holocaust and on genocide issued their first report saying, our preliminary thought is this is genocide. It's only been 1 week, we need a little more time, but this is what we are seeing right now. 1 week, as opposed to 20 years. And that goes to the question of the extraordinary severity of this assault. This was not the attacks that had begun in 2008 and 9, Operation Cast Lead, 2012, 2014, which we thought was as bad as it could ever get, that lasted for 55 days and ended with 2,200 Palestinians killed. There were more than 2,200 Palestinians killed in the first week of this genocide, and it has not been reduced since that time. And now what we see is, number one, an incredible generational divide. This was already underway. This didn't just start on October 7th. You know, back in 2021, when the debate was coming to a head around the issue of apartheid, there was a poll taken by YouGov, one of the big polling operations, of Jewish voters across the country. And it turned out that 25% of Jewish voters said Israel is an apartheid state. They were given 6 choices to describe Israel. And 25% said Israel is an apartheid state, which was shocking, absolutely shocking. For those of us who have worked on this issue for a long time, it was like, that can't be true. And it turned out, yeah, it was true. And what was even more interesting was that 38% of young Jewish voters said Israel is an apartheid state. That's a huge gap, 25 to 38, right? So you had that. Right now, we have 70% of Democrats saying no more aid to Israel. That's another one that's like, whoa, how did that happen? And one of the answers is, and I think we have to be very self-aware and conscious about this, this did not all happen as a result of the long years of very hard work by a very committed movement for Palestinian rights in this country. Some of it happened because of that, but mostly it happened because of what Israel was doing, the genocide Israel was carrying out, and the fact that despite Israel's incredible efforts to keep the international press out of Gaza, they could not keep the word from getting out because of social media, because of alternative media, because of the international press, because of the heroic journalists of Gaza, who whenever there was a moment of access to electricity, the first thing they would do is charge up their phone to get that tape out into the world. And people across this country and around the world, for the first time, were seeing in real time what a genocide looks like. And that's why you had this extraordinary movement that identified their first priority, their second priority, their third priority was ceasefire now. And what was amazing about it, because this was not the same movement as the Palestinian rights movement. That movement grew and was strengthened and did incredible work. The organization I am very privileged to work with, Jewish Voice for Peace, more than doubled its membership without ever issuing a call for members because it just seemed inappropriate to make that call in the midst of a genocide. But despite not ever asking for it, 30,000 new people joined JVP in the last year and a half. So it now has 60,000 members, something like 400,000 online supporters. So all of that happened, but there was this other movement that was bigger and broader than we had ever seen coming out into the streets to defend the rights of Palestinians. And the call was very clear. The call was a unified call for ceasefire now. But it wasn't limited to that, because people began the process of actually redefining what does ceasefire even mean. So the first part of it was, yeah, stop killing people with your bombs. Just stop the killing. That's the first part of ceasefire. But it also meant allow in a huge flood of food, of fuel, of water, of medicine, of everything that has been denied the people of Gaza for 17 years, but especially since this genocide began. The siege of Gaza began in 2006, not in 2025 or 23. But we saw that movement grow and mature, so it was also calling for both of those things: stop the killing, allow in massive amounts of food and fuel and all the other things missing, medicine, and stop sending the weapons. That was a call that had never been so broadly understood and broadly asserted in the streets of this country. In November of 2023, just in the first couple of months after the first month after the genocide began, there were somewhere close to 400,000 people in the streets here saying all of those things. And That has been a game changer. The irony, the horror that we face is that because of the lack of democracy in our country, the fact that public opinion just does not yet have the kind of influence it needs to have on government decisions, whether we're talking about the White House or Congress or anywhere else, whether we're talking about the Biden administration or the Trump administration, this is a bipartisan problem. This is not anything to do with political parties. We have never had that kind of access to government decision-making. That's a huge challenge. We saw Israel last summer across the region, moving to destabilize the whole region. As soon as there was an assault in Damascus that ended up overthrowing the regime of Bashar al-Assad, what was the Israeli response? Not to say, oh, good, now we can have a different kind of relationship. They sent in their military. They attacked virtually the entire military capacity of this country that suddenly had an entirely different government than had ruled there for the past 30 or 40 years between him and his father. And they proceeded to absorb more land, to expand the occupied Golan Heights, which, of course, President Trump has announced the U.S. now believes to belong to Israel, something in complete violation of international law. What did they do in Lebanon when there was this new moment? They attacked southern Lebanon again, began to occupy parts of southern Lebanon. There are still 5 pockets of land in southern Lebanon that are now still occupied by the Israeli military. So all of this is going on, culminating, of course, in the attack on Iran, which, of course, then involved the United States carrying out these completely illegal bombings. So we have this huge dichotomy between the massive shift in public opinion, the mobilization of that public opinion, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the decision by our government to simply ignore that, and the decision by Israel to escalate. So what we are now seeing is an utter escalation that is taking out more lives than ever before on a daily basis. Now, I've got to say, in terms of this book, as all of us who care about Palestinian rights and a whole lot of people who never before cared about Palestinian rights, I was devastated by what was happening in Palestine from the day it began. And I wasn't sure how to go forward. It just seemed like there was nothing we could do that was going to have any impact. I was very lucky. I was able, for a host of reasons, to end up doing some of the work with the South Africans on the campaign to bring a case, for the first time, a case like this, under the terms of the Genocide Convention, to bring Israel to trial in the International Court of Justice, a court that traditionally has been thought to belong not to every country in the world, the way it's supposed to be, like the United Nations. You know, this is the UN court, right? The world court. But traditionally, the only countries that bring lawsuits there are the white colonial countries. Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, the honoraries like Japan and South Korea. Nobody else gets to use that court. It doesn't belong to Africa. It doesn't belong to most of Asia. It doesn't belong to Latin America. But what a surprise, all of a sudden it did. And all of a sudden you saw, how many of you got up at 4 o'clock in the morning on the day that the South Africans were arguing their case in front of the court? Oh, come on, really? No, okay, one person at least. You should have. It was an amazing thing to see. This rainbow coalition of brilliant lawyers arguing this case. And it was in a moment, I was on a tweet thread with a bunch of people in Palestine, in South Africa, a couple in The Hague, and 1 or 2 of us here in the US, going back and forth, just responding to it all. And one South African friend of mine wrote at the time, I have never been so proud to be a South African, and I've never been so proud to be a human being. It was extraordinary. Now, we don't know what the final decisions are going to be, but we do know that the preliminary decision of the International Court of Justice was something we had never seen before. The International Court ordering Israel to stop killing people. That was just the preliminary part. You know, this was extraordinary. Israel, of course, ignored it all. And so far, there has been no consequence for that. We still have a lot of work to do. But it was the first time that we were really seeing how international law can be used by people, by governments, by mobilizations, by movements that have never used it in these ways before. So I want to say just a couple of other things, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions and whatever. And one of those is that this whole idea about international law is really important. And I think for a lot of people, it seems really complicated and weird. And come on, how do you even read that stuff, right? Because a lot of international law is like that. It's kind of designed to be completely opaque. You read it and say, what did I just read? What do those words even mean, you know? But the Genocide Convention is different. The Genocide Convention is actually quite simple, as is the Apartheid Convention. Everybody can read those. For some act of violence to constitute genocide, there have to be two things. Number one, there has to be an intention to destroy all or part of a group, as a group. You don't have to kill anybody necessarily. It just means you have to create conditions that some group that exists, a social group, a racial group, a religious group, a language group, whatever it is, that either the whole group or part of the group can't exist as a group anymore. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to carry out at least one of 5 specific acts of violence. The first is killing people in the group. The second is seriously injuring people in the group. The third is creating conditions that make it impossible for the group to exist. And the last 2 have to do with how children are allowed or not allowed to come into being in the group. So they're very specific. You know, anybody can sort of see that. The problem with holding anybody accountable for genocide historically has always been it's really hard to prove intention. You know, that's true in domestic law too. Like if you break into a car because you're just in a bad mood and you happen to have a brick in your hand and you throw a rock at a window and break it, that's a crime. You know, you broke somebody else's property, but it's not what's called a specific intent crime. If you break into the car because you see a wallet in there and you want to grab the wallet, that's burglary. That's a specific intent crime. You broke in to get that wallet. That's the difference. This is the same thing. It's not just about killing people or expelling people. It's doing it for the intention of destroying a group. And what made it possible this time was that Israel was proud of what it was doing. Its prime minister, its other ministers, its leaders, its members of the Knesset, its academics, its intellectuals, its poets, its musicians, all talked about they are all our enemy. Kill them all, even the children. This was familiar language to those of us in this country. Those of us who have grown up knowing anything about the Indian Wars in this country remember hearing something about a place called Sand Creek. The Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1862, where a colonel in the US military, John Chivington, who happened to be a Methodist minister, interestingly enough, ordered his soldiers to attack a peaceful village in the middle of the night. They were all sleeping on the banks of Sand Creek. And some of his soldiers came back and said, we can't really do that. We promised to protect these people. That was part of the deal of shoving them off their land. And anyway, they're sound asleep, and there's children, and there's women and older people. And he said, it doesn't matter. Nits make lice. Kill them all. That was the language of the Indian Wars here. That was the language in the Israeli Knesset that we were hearing over and over and over again. So when the South African team was producing their evidence, they didn't have to ask anybody to believe something. All they did was play the tape of Israeli leaders telling the world that they wanted to kill them all. Children, elders, it didn't matter. And their answer from the Israelis was not that it didn't happen. They didn't say, you made this up. They said, oh, they weren't serious. They were just joking. Or they were just angry. It was just kind of, you know, people talk like that. And first of all, people don't talk like that. Normal people don't talk like that. But the other part of it is, it would be a little, maybe, more difficult to prove if you didn't have this close connection between what they were claiming in the Knesset and the poets and all this stuff, and what the soldiers actually did. When it matches like that, you can't really claim they didn't mean it. So that's where we were left. There's a whole lot of other things to talk about. But one of the reasons I wrote this book was that there was this whole new movement of people who had not necessarily ever really thought very much about Palestine or Israel. Maybe they had studied Israel in school because, you study Israel in school. It's one of the most studied countries in the world. But you probably didn't really think about it since 10th grade history class, because why would you, right? But all of a sudden, it was in your face 24/7, on your phone, in your computer, on your television, in your radio, everywhere you looked. You were seeing what genocide looks like close up. And I thought, well, this is a chance when a lot of people, and some of these extraordinary students among them who were carrying out the encampments and doing teach-ins in their encampments. They were celebrating Passover, the Jewish holiday of Pesach, in their encampments because so many Jewish students were part of them. And they were doing teach-ins on this history, but you can't learn all that when you're trying to do a teach-in in the middle of an encampment that's under this kind of pressure from your campus leadership, right? So I thought, that's who this book is for. All these people who are now open to these new ideas that they've never really thought much about, but they never had much of a chance to answer all these basic questions that Khalil was mentioning. I'm not going to answer them all today, so don't get your hopes up. But that's what the book is for. But these are the questions that people ask, and sometimes it's kind of embarrassing. It's like, are all Jews Zionists? That's a real question. There's no reason to be embarrassed about asking that question. No reason people should know that, because Jewish organizations who define themselves that way also define themselves as Zionists without ever saying that not all Jews are Zionists. That the 25 adults and 38% of young people among the Jewish voting community who say that Israel is an apartheid state, many of them, not all of them, some of them may be Zionists as well, but a lot of them will say they're not Zionists. They're anti-Zionist, they're non-Zionist, they're something else. We don't hear enough about that. So that's an important part of that answer, all of this history. So that's what it's for. It's designed for people who never really had a chance to learn all the stuff that they're now very curious about. And thankfully, there is this movement that has pulled in all of these extraordinary people, maybe some of you in this room, who had just really never thought about it much before. And this is the chance to learn some more. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for our questions to come.
Thank you, Phyllis. Why don't you stay at the microphone?
Okay.
It'll be easier. Go ahead.
Yeah, then I'll take this. Yes.
All right, it's your turn. So if you have any questions at all, please go ahead and use the cards in front of you and raise your hand when you're ready, and somebody will pick up those cards from you and bring them over here. And I will be more than delighted to accommodate as many as we could within the allotted time we have left for Q&A. Let me start by asking Phyllis a personal question. This is not your first primer, right? I mean, you've done a series of those, although the circumstances probably were slightly different. Did you find it challenging to write a primer in the middle of a raging war of this magnitude?
Yes, absolutely.
How?
Well, the earlier primers, there were five of them, I think. There were 5 different ones. One of them, was on Israel-Palestine. That one went through 7 updates. And in each one, we just added a bunch of new questions that we thought people were now asking that they weren't asking before. And eventually, after the first one was back at the time of the Second Intifada, so that was like 2002, I think I wrote that first one. And then it would be like every 3 or 4 years, there would be an updated edition. And it got really messy, for one thing, because we weren't really redoing the whole book. We were just adding more questions at the end, so they were kind of like in no order, and it was hard to follow. So part of it was, okay, we need a new one. We've sold out of the old one. It's time for the new one. And I thought, we can't just keep doing that. First of all, there's just too many new questions. And then secondly, this is a very different moment. So some things do not fit into the sort of very short 1 or 2 pages. There's some things that need a longer articulation. And I realized I needed to do a different kind of a book. So I wrote a very different book. A lot of the same questions are there. I rewrote all of them, so they're more updated versions. We took out some of the old questions that don't seem so relevant anymore. But it also, the sections in the last part, which deal with what happened on October 7th, what was the aftermath of it, it was very, very difficult to write, as you can imagine. partly because one of the things I write about is that much of what happened on October 7th, the attack led by Hamas, but with the participation of others from Gaza as well, both some in other organizations and some just angry young men who had lived, in many cases, virtually their entire life. This was 17 years into a blocking of Gaza, a siege of Gaza. That meant the entire strip was walled off, surrounded by soldiers, with Israel controlling every bit of food, fuel, pencils, anything that went in was under Israeli control. They used the model of the US sanctions against Iraq, which, as some of you may remember from Madeleine Albright's famous words, killed over 500,000 children. So in that context, it was, for many, I think, not a surprise that this happened. It was shocking. And the part of it that involved civilians was clearly a violation of international law. And what was not as clear to a lot of people is that the part that was not against civilians, because the first targets were military bases were the first targets on October 7th, was the legitimate right of an occupied population to use military force to end that occupation. Doesn't mean it's necessarily a good idea, doesn't mean everybody agrees with it, but it does mean that in international law, the right to resist is a right. It has its limits, and that limit is, it means your targets must be military and not civilians. 2/3 of the people who were killed were civilians. Complete violation of international law. 1/3 were military. That was not a violation. And that is a very hard balance. It's very hard for people who saw only the horror of it, because it was horrifying what happened on that day. It's very hard to imagine that any part of it was not completely illegal. So how to write about that was very difficult. How to write about the aftermath of it, how to write about the election, which I had to write that last piece just in the last couple of days after the election, before the inauguration, before we saw what we are now seeing of what this administration has brought to bear, certainly in the region, but not only, certainly here at home as well, in relation to our immigrant population, in relation to so many other things. This is before all of that. But I knew things were coming, so that was very difficult. So the challenges were enormous. And then the other part of it was, it's always hard, and this was maybe the hardest part, to sit and work on a book when you know under the best of conditions, any book anybody writes is something that can change the medium and long-term discourse on an issue. That's what a book does. There's no way a book written at that time was going to have any impact on what was going on the ground. And that's what I couldn't face. And there were days I had to just stop and not write and not think about it and just go out to some protest, because there were protests every day. I had to just be doing something more visceral somehow. I was on the phone every day with friends. I didn't call my friends in Gaza because I didn't want them to use up the little bit of battery life they might have on their phone when they had more important things. But I was calling friends, Palestinians and others who work on Palestinian rights all around the world, in South Africa, in India, in Europe, everywhere, just to hear other voices of what other people were doing, because it was so hard to be working on something that I knew was not going to have the effect of ending this horror that we were seeing, the starvation, the murder of children. So that's the hard part.
Thank you, Phyllis. Appreciate that. We have a question from Noor Taha from Middle East Democracy Center. Basically, he's asking, when can we expect to see this discourse shift translate into a political reality change in Palestine on the ground, considering how fast the destruction on the ground is happening?
Ooh, such a
tough one.
Very important question. The bottom line answer is I don't know. I can't tell you an answer to that. I will say that the work of parts of this ceasefire movement and part of the Palestinian rights movement working together with people who were already concerned about the rise of authoritarianism, the threat of fascism. So things like the uncommitted movement that emerged in the run-up to the election played a huge role in all of this. It gave people an opportunity to link the issue of what the U.S. accountability is. What is the U.S. complicity for what Israel is doing? Israel could not carry out this genocide without our money, our weapons, and our political protection. With any one of those three missing, this war ends. The weapons, 70% of the weapons are provided by the United States. Most of the rest come from Germany, not all. Most of the rest come from Germany, who just announced they're not going to send any more if they can be used in Gaza. I don't know if I believe what they said, but it's a huge step forward for Germany to have said that. But 70% come from us. In 2024, the United States paid 40% of the entire Israeli military budget. 40%. I mean, compared to our military budget, that's chump change. It's a rounding error. But nonetheless, the fact that our tax money paid for 40% of what it costs to carry out this genocide makes us directly complicit. So that understanding, the fact that everybody in this country who pays taxes, for those of us who are citizens, everyone we vote for becomes part of how this complicity works. So I think we're moving towards that. We're moving towards a way that this issue, for the first time, is intersecting with the broader progressive movement that is fighting very hard against what we're seeing in the streets of Washington. We're fighting against militarization internationally as well as here at home, whether it's in Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., or perhaps in the future some other city. That means that this issue is a more important component. I don't know how many of you saw the poll in March of this year that asked voters who voted for Biden in 2020 and did not vote for Kamala Harris in 2024, which means either they voted for Trump, they didn't vote at all, they voted for Congress but didn't vote for president, or they voted for someone else for president. Could mean any of those things. They asked all those people, what's the single most important reason you didn't vote for Biden's heir, for Kamala Harris? And the choices, I thought the first choice would have been the economy, right? The economy was tanking. No, the first choice was Gaza, 29%. The economy was second place with 24%. But 29% of that poll said that the most important reason, and they said, we know you may have had more than one reason, but pick the most important one, that was Gaza. That's never happened before. That ordinary voters who do or don't ordinarily care about foreign policy at all, let alone the specifics of Israel, Palestine, whatever, 29% said that was the reason they could not bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris, even though they recognized that the likely alternative was going to be somebody who they could not face voting for. So I think that those things are changing. How long it's going to take, I wish I knew that, and I wish I could say tomorrow, but I can't say that.
Yeah. Phyllis, in terms of, you referred to the complicity by the United States in terms of subsidizing at least, 40% of Israel's budget in this war. Has anybody done a comprehensive study of the cost of this war to the United States? I mean, in addition to the fact that we know that Biden sent at one point 17 or 18 billion, and then we have 22. Another equal amount by the Trump administration in its first few weeks in office. But is there any figures showing the total?
Well, there are figures. I think the total that has been sent is just over 22 billion. Mm-hmm. There's another, I think it's about 11 or 12 billion that's been authorized, has not yet been sent.
In the pipeline.
There have been efforts in the Senate most recently, led by Bernie Sanders, for two groups of weapons to be prevented from being shipped. They're what's called the Joint Declarations of what does the R stand for? JDRs, forgetting what the term is. But it's basically a vote by either the House or the Senate to say, we reject this. It's a joint resolution of rejection, something like that. And it didn't pass, what a surprise, but more than half the Democrats in the Senate voted for it. That had never happened before. 27 out of 46, I guess it is. That was unprecedented. So, we can look at these things and say, we are moving forward. There is more support for these things than ever before. We have things like, my new book, we have protests, we have many things that is changing the discourse. And the medium and long-term future, to my mind, looks pretty optimistic. The problem is we don't have a long-term because people are dying today. And that's the challenge we all face. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Dahlia, an independent researcher. She's saying, how can a country with an eschatological vision of bringing about a big war, Armageddon, so to speak, to achieve greater Israel, how can a country like this be stopped? Or can it?
Yeah, there's lots of ways it can be stopped. We're talking about this country, not Israel, I think, at the moment. And it's a huge challenge. I think people are probably familiar with the fact that in this country, the traditional, more well-known, largely Jewish component of the Israel lobby is not nearly as large, as popular, and as influential, particularly in the Republican Party, as the Christian Zionist lobby, led by Kufi, Christians United for Israel. A much more powerful grouping in terms of the ability of ministers to urge their members to vote. They have a much larger impact on the vote than the Jewish community, which is tiny. But there is still, from both of those communities, there is a lot of money, there's a lot of influence, and there's a lot, these days, there's a lot of fear. The weaponization of false claims of anti-Semitism has made it very, very hard. We're seeing in terms of what's happened to students, what's happened to immigrants. The first groupings to be targeted, the first immigrants to be picked up off the street by these masked thugs and thrown into unmarked cars and flown across the country to be kept for days without their family even being able to find out what they are. The first of those immigrants were Palestinian. The second were the students who were being arrested for protesting in support of Palestinian rights. So all of these things are now coming together. The analysis of Christian Zionism says that it's not just about supporting the country of Israel, it's about supporting the Zionist project of ingathering all the Jews around the world into this one place, because they believe that until that happens, it's impossible for the second coming, right? Now, I got to say, as a Jew, this is not great, because what happens when the second coming happens, according to this theory, is all the Jews will be there, and then they will all either convert or die, which is not like the best choice to have, I guess. But, I'm not a very religious Jew, but it is my culture, my people, so yeah. So this is a big problem. Challenging Christian Zionism in this country, its influence not only around Israel specifically, but that's a big part of it, is a big challenge. And thankfully, there are really important organizations like the Sabeel Center, like Christians for, Christians for Middle East Peace, Churches for Middle East Peace, Churches for Middle East Peace. There's a host of others that are working hard to challenge Christian Zionism. Repairers of the Breach, Reverend William Barber, some of you will know his work. He's done a lot of work on this question of Christian Zionism, and it's tied to Christian nationalism in this country. And it's racist to the core. And that's where there's a lot of work to be done.
Dr. Al-Ubaid has a question for you, Phyllis. Why don't we use colonization versus occupation in our dialogue?
Well, a lot of us do. Again, it's one of, the question of settler colonialism. I talk about it in my book, but I don't use it every other sentence, right? Partly because it's not common language for most people. It is for a certain sector of academics. Post-colonial studies is, obviously the centerpiece of it, but there's a ton of people in this country who have never heard of post-colonial studies, right? It's an academic discourse that doesn't affect most people's lives. So for some of us, we really try to write and speak in ways that are accessible to everybody. So I think the question of settler colonialism is a really important one because it goes to the origins of Israel. And I'll tell you one of my great stories, which is in the book. There's people talk about like, why was Israel created, right? And there's a host of reasons why it became a majority view in the Jewish community, which it wasn't from its origins in the 1890s until about the time of the Holocaust. It was a minority position in the Jewish community, largely because it called for people to pack up and leave where they and their parents and grandparents and great-great-parents and on had lived for centuries, for generations, because they didn't belong there. They really belonged in this new place that we're going to build in the Middle East. But it was also a very clear understanding of the people who created Zionism as a nationalist movement for Jews in the era of colonialism, starting in the 1890s. They understood that they needed a colonial sponsor to survive, so they went to the Tsar of Russia, they went to the Ottoman Emperor, they went to, ultimately, it was the British Crown that gave them the support that they wanted. But they were prepared to get that support from any other empire that was out there. And the founder of modern Zionism wrote in his diaries, Theodor Herzl, wrote in his diaries about the letters that he wrote to somebody named Cecil Rhodes. Some of you may know that name, one of the infamous British colonialists for whom Zimbabwe for many, many decades was called Rhodesia. So he writes to Cecil Rhodes asking for help, asking for Rhodes to beg the British Crown to support this project. And he says in his letter, "You may ask me, why am I asking you for help? You're interested in Africa, I'm interested in this little piece of Arabia. You're concerned about Englishmen, I'm concerned about Jews. So why am I asking you for help?" And then he answers his own question and he says, "Because our projects are both something colonial." I read that and said, whoa, nobody ever taught me that in Sunday school. And that was the basis for my break with Zionism. No, really.
No, I'm laughing at Sunday school, but that's all right.
I went to Sunday school. I taught Sunday school.
Did you?
I did. My parents both taught Sunday school, yes.
All right.
Don't laugh at me. So, actually, you can. But, that was a very big deal when I saw that. That was the basis for my break with Zionism, was like, oh my God, I never understood that before. And I learned a very sanitized and false version of what Zionism was all about. So that's something that people aren't very familiar with. How would they be? They don't teach it in high school. They don't teach it in grammar school. So that's the kind of information that can help people sort this stuff out. So it means, yeah, we should talk about colonialism and the role of it but not everybody has to know the history of Israel and why it was created and the history of colonialism in order to be against genocide, right? You can be against genocide and play a huge role and do all those important things for all the right reasons, period, full stop. You don't ever have to study this stuff. If you want to, it's important that you get it right.
Yeah.
But you don't have to. Yeah.
All right. We have a question from Sophia from the Embassy of Jordan. Why have convictions of Israel violating international law failed to manifest into one form or another of like real repercussions? What does this say about international law?
Very good question. The easy answer is a two-word answer, United States. In this case, that's why Israel is not facing real consequences yet. But I do have an answer for this one. And that is that the weakness in international law around the question of accountability, especially accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, the Genocide Convention, the Apartheid Convention, all of those most serious crimes in the world, right? The weakness in holding governments accountable is there's no enforcement, right? So officially, the World Court is an enforceable decision-making body, but it doesn't have an army. It doesn't even have like a process server to run around the world, handing out subpoenas or something. None of that exists. What it does have is credentials, credibility for what it represents. It is the UN court. It refers in its rulings directly to the responsibility of the United Nations and often refers specifically to both the Security Council and the General Assembly to implement its decisions. So in this case, stuff goes to the Security Council. Well, the Security Council, as we know, was designed with victor's justice after World War II. The 5 permanent members have a veto. So the US routinely vetoes all of those resolutions for sanctions, for all that stuff. Then it goes to the General Assembly, where these things pass with an enormous majority, right? The US has no veto there. It often will threaten other countries, bribe them, et cetera. It has a whole history of that, to not vote against US interests, but they don't have any legal way to stop it. But the US then comes back and says, well, it doesn't matter what the General Assembly does because the General Assembly doesn't have any enforcement rights, which is technically true. Except there is something called the Uniting for Peace precedent, which is how the US got the United Nations to go to war in Korea in 1951, that says that if the Security Council is stymied, if it can't make a decision because of the veto of one of them, the General Assembly can make a decision that becomes enforceable, if it chooses to do that, on an issue that would otherwise belong to the Security Council. The Security Council is supposed to have control of all issues around peace and security. But if they can't decide, it goes to the General Assembly. What does that mean? It means the General Assembly could decide to send troops, to do many different things. Will that happen? No. But enforcement does exist. Look around the room. This is the enforcement of international law, is people. Because we know it works, because we have the model of it. And South Africa comes in again here. In the 1980s, at the height of the anti-apartheid movement around South Africa, all around the world, governments were under incredible pressure from their own people, saying, you've got to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Enough is enough. You've got to do this. There's got to be arms embargoes. There's got to be banking sanctions. There's got to be trade sanctions. There's got to be sports sanctions. That was a big one in South Africa because the Springboks were like the heroes of South Africa, right? And the thought that they might not be able to play was not okay. So that starts happening all around the world. In the US, there's this powerful movement led by the Black Caucus of the Congress and a number of black churches fighting against apartheid South Africa, demanding sanctions. And the US is saying, no, we're not going to do this. We're never going to vote for this. But eventually, enough US allies do vote for it because they're under pressure in their own capitals, from their own country. People who are holding up these resolutions of the General Assembly and saying, we want you to do numbers 1, 3, 7, 9, and 10. You don't have to do 2, 4, and 5. You have to do these. And they start doing it. They start imposing sanctions. Eventually, the US is under enough pressure that the movement here is able to win. The Congress votes for sanctions. The Reagan administration says, sorry, we're vetoing it. They get enough votes in the Congress to override the veto. And the US imposes sanctions on apartheid South Africa. That's what we need to do. We need to have enough countries around the world that are putting pressure on their own governments. That's why I say we need people, movements, the movement for Palestinian rights, which is growing all around the world, using the framework of boycott, divestment, and sanctions to get to this issue of sanctions. We're doing it here too. It's going to take a while. And again, we don't have much time. But this is how it can work. This is how we get real enforcement of international law, is by making it politically too expensive for countries to violate it. The countries don't have to want it. They just have to realize that if they don't, they risk, well, it could be being overthrown.
Yeah. Eddie invites you, if you have any comments on Rabi' Aghbari's concept, his work that he did on the Nakba as a legal concept and its relationship with the current conflict in Gaza. Is this, from your perspective, credible approach to pursue?
Which I'm thinking of something different. I think. What was
this is Rabi' Aghbari's work toward Nakba as a legal concept, right?
Oh, right. You know, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an international lawyer. So I don't know what the consequences of doing that. What the issue here is that there's people that are proposing that the Nakba should be identified as a specific kind of international law, as a specific crime within the broad framework of international humanitarian law, the laws of war. My sense of it, and again, I'm not a lawyer here, but my sense of it is, I don't know what that helps. It seems to me that there's an advantage of saying this is one kind of violation of the Genocide Convention, which already has more signatures than I think any other part of international law. More countries are are states party of the Genocide Convention, which, unlike other parts of international law, puts obligations on them. You know, a country that signs on to the Genocide Convention isn't just saying, we think other countries should not carry out a genocide. They are taking on the obligation for themselves to do whatever is in their power to prevent a genocide, and if a genocide begins to happen, to stop it. This is why in 1994, when the genocide was going on in Rwanda, the Clinton administration was not willing to call it a genocide. Not because they thought it wasn't the right term, but because if they did, they would be obligated to do something to stop it, and they were not prepared to do that. So there's consequences of that. I'm not sure what is gained by the notion of
in 1948. That's
right.
The law review article that
right.
was continued.
Right. I mean, the notion. Richard Falk has written about this. One of the former UN special rapporteurs on Palestine, and a great mentor of mine. He's written about it in the context of a specific crime that goes to the continuation of a violation, which could include this. So again, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not sure what is gained by making the Nakba the specific crime, as opposed to saying that something that is a crime, like in this context, it's an occupation, a military occupation, is not itself criminal. You may carry it out in criminal ways if you don't abide by the Geneva Conventions, if you carry out collective punishment, if you do X, Y, and Z. Those are separate crimes. But it's not illegal to occupy another land in the context of a war. The assumption is it's there for a brief time and then it's over. So these are laws that govern what you do while that brief moment is happening. The issue is, if it's continuing for so long, does that become a separate kind of crime? Which I think is right, but it goes to the question of expanded time, not that there's something particular about that occupation that's different than other occupations.
Thank you, Phyllis. Appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And let me invite Shamir and Raj, two questions we didn't get to come forward. We would love both of us to chat with you about your questions. Thanks, everybody, again, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you.